Nice. Everything is urgent and solutions have to be reached as soon as possible in the areas of energy resilience, stability in the South China Sea, and even the situation in Myanmar. But after a whole day of meetings, summits, 3 days of meetings actually, and a whole day of summits, 2 sessions under the leaders level meetings, there are no specifics to be spoken of or even a timeline to be announced from leaders of ASEAN. Hi, my name is Cupin. You are watching Rappler, and I'm at the International Media Center at the Mactan World Museum here in Lapu-Lapu City in the province of Cebu, where an hour ago, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Philippine President and Chairperson of ASEAN, held a press conference to speak to the media about the outcomes of the 48th ASEAN Summit. And this is the first leaders level summit with the Philippines as chairperson, the first leaders level meeting for 2026, as we have discussed earlier, as has been widely reported. Yung focus ng 48th ASEAN Summit is specifically on the effects of the Middle East war on Southeast Asia. First and foremost, the fluctuations of energy prices and supply that has affected a lot of nations in Southeast Asia, most specifically the Philippines, as well as food security, and finally the safety of ASEAN nationals all over the world, but specifically in the Middle East. So it is very clear heading into the 48th ASEAN Summit. What's happening behind me, actually, you'll hear it from time to time, is the gala dinner of the ASEAN Summit with, of course, President Marcos and First Lady Liza Araneta Marcos hosting the representatives or member state leaders of ASEAN to formally wrap up the summit. Pero yung substantive parts or yung mga seryosong meetings in the form of a plenary session and a retreat session wrapped up earlier today at the Mactan Expo, which is like a stone's throw away from where I am, and at the Shangri-La Mactan, which is also quite close to where I am. So in the days leading up to the 48th ASEAN Summit, foreign ministers and economic ministers were already repeating yung or emphasizing the fact that amid crisis in the Middle East and shocks to the global oil supply and the economy, global economy in general, it becomes all the more important for ASEAN to come together, talk amongst each other, and to agree among each other on a way moving forward. Marcos again highlighted this in his speeches and remarks earlier today. So ano nga ba ang output or ano yung outcomes ito based on the discussions by the leaders over 2 sessions today? Ang sabi ni President Marcos during the press conference earlier, all the leaders have agreed that there is a need for ASEAN to expedite the ratification of the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Petroleum Security or yung APSA. Kumbaga yung vision nito is a reservoir of sort for ASEAN to tap into to avoid future shocks should another oil crisis be triggered by geopolitical frictions or geopolitical issues even in other parts of the world. And they also agreed na kailangan magkaroon na ng ASEAN power grid. However, as in all cases in ASEAN or any multinational, multilateral organization, ang tanong dito ay how do you exactly implement this? What is the timeline of these aspirations? President Marcos said earlier, wala pa. Kumbaga, nag-agree lang yung mga leaders unanimously, obviously because ASEAN operates on consensus that this is important, this is a priority for the bloc. However, this is something that energy ministers will have to flesh out, and officials below these energy ministers will have to fine-tune the details of in the months to come or in the weeks to come, months to come, years to come. We don't know. Walang timeline na na-provide kanina si President Marcos. On the issue of food security, sabi din ni President Marcos, nag-agree din naman lahat na it's important to keep supply chains open within the region, within the bloc, as well as to ensure that there's a food reserve system for ASEAN as well. Leaders also, we expect a leader statement on the Middle East. As I am talking to you live right now, wala pa ata sa website ng ASEAN. Let's do a quick check on the official ASEAN channels. There is a statement already on the maritime cooperation, but we'll talk about that a little more later. So itong leader statement on the Middle East, sabi ni President Marcos, this is a statement or a position that would provide practical measures for ASEAN's collective response to the situation currently in the Middle East. It also sets the foundation for coordinated regional response should something like this happen again in the future. Now, the two keywords there, practical measures, and sets the foundations of future responses, which also means, again, there are no specifics yet to be provided for from the 48th ASEAN Summit. Now, again, this is something that ministers and other ASEAN officials will have to flesh out in the future. How soon? How long will it take? Wala ding provide na specifics. Thus far, yung ASEAN chair, the Philippines, and ASEAN chairperson, President Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos also pointed out or told the media that there was wide consensus that ASEAN needs to establish an ASEAN Maritime Center. But again, the details of the implementation of the Maritime Center, where it's going to be hosted, what it's going to do exactly, and yung mechanisms involved in this Maritime Center, hindi pa clear. But the Philippines is making a pitch for it to be based here in the Philippines. Where exactly in the Philippines, wala ding nabanggit kanina. Nung tinanong si President Marcos kung bakit important or ano yung context ng establishment of the proposed ASEAN Maritime Center, what he said was, you have to understand the context of what he termed as an unreadable South China Sea. Now, yung context dito, there are overlapping claims in the South China Sea. Several of the claimants are members of ASEAN, including the Philippines. So, that is also the context as to why there are ongoing negotiations for a code of conduct in the South China Sea between ASEAN and China. Now, ASEAN hopes, and Manila as chairperson hopes, for those negotiations to conclude before the year's end, before the end of the chairmanship of the Philippines. However, nung tinanong yung DFA or Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines a few days ago as to the progress of the COC, kung meron pag-uusapan sa 48th ASEAN Summit, obviously hindi, or walang napag-usapan. However, negotiations did take place in Beijing just a week ago, or a few weeks after, or a few days before the start of the events here in Cebu province. Now, yung negotiations for a code of conduct in the South China Sea, serious negotiations, yung first draft na text started almost 10 years ago. Yung aspiration to create a COC was formalized in 2002. More than 2 decades ago. So these things take time in ASEAN, especially because ASEAN does operate on consensus, and in the context of negotiations for the negotiations for the COC on the South China Sea, you need consensus not just from ASEAN but also from China, who the bloc is talking to in the context of ASEAN. But I think what's interesting what I think is interesting from Marcos's discussion on the urgency of creating an ASEAN Maritime Center is that he did mention the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, what was once a thriving maritime waterway where a huge percentage of crude oil and petroleum products coming from the Gulf would pass through. Up to 90% of the products that pass through would eventually wind up in Asia, which also explains why it's Asia, and including Southeast Asia, that have felt talaga the effects of the restrictions or the restrictions of movement in the Strait of Hormuz. So he mentioned the Strait of Hormuz in the context of explaining why it's important to maintain a peaceful and stable South China Sea. Almost a third of world trade passes through the South China Sea, which means yung stability ng South China Sea, yung passage through the South China Sea is not just a concern of ASEAN or of China, but it's a concern really of the global economy. Finally, ang pinag-usapan din kanina during the ASEAN 48th ASEAN Summit retreat session, the more informal one. In fact, they held it at Pactan, Shangri-La, in what Marcos called was a non-denominational chapel where traditionally weddings are held. Sabi nga niya, sana daw the spirit of romance helps them or eases the conversation perhaps in the retreat, which by the way went over time. Kaya na late din yung press briefing kanina. The President Marcos did mention that some ASEAN leaders aired their frustration over the lack of progress in Myanmar. In 2021, leaders of ASEAN agreed on a 5-point consensus, parang peace parang kumbaga peace plan ito to normalize the situation in Myanmar, which is also why Myanmar in ASEAN is represented not by a leader of what was then a junta or even any political representation. It's represented by the Permanent Secretary of Foreign Affairs ng Myanmar. So, Marcos mentioned earlier, it's a tragedy when a family member is left out for whatever reason, referring to Myanmar as a member of the ASEAN family. But again, no concrete solutions or no concrete changes perhaps were mentioned or agreed upon by the leaders. Sabi naman ni Marcos, it's very unlikely, or it's not, the leaders are not inclined to make any dramatic shifts whatsoever on how it approaches Myanmar thus far. But again, in previous summits, leaders have said that they were dissatisfied with or they saw that hindi nagko-comply yung junta or yung leadership in Myanmar with a 5-point consensus. So again, to summarize things up, there was a lot of agreement that these things should happen, that these things are urgent, and that they have to be attended to as soon as possible. But there are no specifics to be said, and there are no timelines to be given for now from leaders of ASEAN. Ministers are expected to jump off, kumbaga, from the summit and carry on the conversation and flesh out these details. But again, with the pace that ASEAN typically, or negotiations in ASEAN typically goes through it, we're not sure at this point if it'll take weeks, months, or even years to establish these rather ambitious, progressive, and as Marcos himself pointed out, new ideas for the bloc to protect itself from shocks caused by geopolitical tensions in other parts of the world. So again, ASEAN wants to protect itself. ASEAN wants mechanisms to work better, but the details of which those things, those changes, those advances are going to happen will have to be fleshed out in the weeks or months to come. We expect ministers, energy ministers, foreign ministers, economic, trade ministers, even the social-cultural community to convene either in regular meetings or through special meetings in the coming months as well. Again, still with Manila as host. This will be, kumbaga, the last major hosting of Cebu, at least in the ASEAN calendar so far, if you recall, because of the oil crisis in the Middle East and the subsequent declaration of a national state of energy emergency in the Philippines. Manila has decided to scale down a lot of its hosting of ASEAN, which has meant na for most of the meetings will be done online, except for meetings like the summits, as well as some select ministerial level meetings. So we'll see how that progresses, again, depending on the situation in the Middle East and depending on how ASEAN states collectively decide in the months to come if it should tweak yet again how it approaches these meetings related to the bloc. For more updates or for more details on what has transpired here in Cebu, you can visit a live updates page on the Rappler page. Right behind me, I think one of the last... Oh, the leaders are complete and therefore they're about to start the gala dinner. We are running late with the gala dinner because the retreat also ran late at medyo nag-extend yung press briefing ni President Marcos kanina. So for more updates on ASEAN, you can follow Rappler. You can go to the Rappler website. You can download the Rappler app. Updates are there. And I'll see you in the next major ASEAN meeting, perhaps. There are several coming up soon. There's a foreign ministers meeting happening in a few months, I think in Manila. And then finally, of course, there is a November summit scheduled, another leaders level meeting scheduled in November in Pasay City at the PICC. So that's it so far from Cebu. Again, you are watching Rappler. My name is Cupin, and thank you for watching.